Comrades, there is a truth so stark, so undeniable, that once spoken aloud it shakes the foundation of every illusion you were taught to believe. The power you think the ruling class holds over you is nothing more than the power you have not yet reclaimed. The system that limits you is not an immovable force, it is a structure built on your labor, sustained by your obedience, and shaken the moment you open your eyes to its contradictions. From the very moment you wake each day, stepping into factories, offices, fields, and streets, you confront a world shaped not by collective human need, but by the insatiable hunger for profit. You are told this system is inevitable. You are told inequality is natural. You are told freedom exists in the very chains that quietly bind you. And yet beneath the weight of exploitation lies a truth that cannot be buried. The oppressed are the true creators of everything that sustains society. The ruling class produces nothing, it merely appropriates. It takes the fruit of your labor, transforms your exhaustion into its luxury, and forces you to accept the theft as order and stability. The factories you sweat in, the machines you operate, the wealth you generate, all of it depends on you and collapses without you. But the system hides this fact behind layers of ideology, teaching you to blame yourself for struggles that are engineered, to see competition where solidarity should stand, and to view the suffering of your fellow workers as an unfortunate accident rather than a deliberate feature. Every injustice you face, your low wages, your uncertain future, your lack of control over the conditions of your life, is not an error, it is design. For the capitalist mode of production thrives only when the worker is separated from the product of their labor, alienated from their own potential, and divided from their fellow laborers. The more you are isolated, the easier you are to control. The more you believe that power lies only in institutions above you, the less you attempt to wield your own. But look closely, comrades. Look with the clarity of those who have begun to see their chains. Who turns the wheels of industry? Who extracts the minerals from the earth? Who builds the cities, lays the roads, harvests the crops, and keeps society alive? It is you, the working class, the oppressed, the dispossessed. You are told you are powerless. But the system that claims superiority trembles at your unity. It fears your consciousness. It dreads the moment you recognize not only the injustice you endure, but the immense collective strength you hold. For when the oppressed see themselves as the engine of history, the ruling class loses the ideological weapon it relies upon, the illusion of inevitability. No tyrant ever ruled without convincing the oppressed that they are weak. No system ever survived when the masses understood their true power. This is why you are suffocated with distractions, why you are encouraged to fight each other for crumbs instead of demanding your rightful share of the loaf. Why you are told to be grateful for exploitation dressed as opportunity. Every mechanism of society, from media to schools, from workplaces to governments, reinforces the same deceit, that the world as it exists is unchangeable. But history speaks differently. Every revolution, every movement toward justice, every transformation that shattered the old order emerged not from the benevolence of the elite, but from the courage of those who refused to accept exploitation as destiny. From the workers who united across borders, the peasants who rose against feudal chains, the laborers who shut down industries with their collective strength, change was born. And now it is your turn. Rise above oppression. Rise above the lies that shrink your power. Rise above the systems that depend on your silence. You must recognize that your liberation will never be handed to you, it must be seized. Through organization, through solidarity, through the unbreakable unity of the oppressed, you can dismantle the structures that exploit you. The ruling class may hold wealth, but you hold numbers. They may command institutions, but you command production. They may possess capital, but you possess the capacity to bring society to a halt and to rebuild it anew. Do not underestimate what becomes possible when workers stand together, refusing to be divided by race, nationality, religion, language, or any boundary imposed to weaken your solidarity. The chains you bear today are not the chains you must carry tomorrow. Comrades, history is calling, and it calls for courage. It calls for awakening. It calls for action. You are more powerful than the system that limits you because the system cannot survive a single day without you. And once you reclaim that truth, once you stand not as isolated individuals but as a united class, the world as it exists will begin to tremble. Now rise. Rise with the strength that comes from understanding your worth. Rise with the fire of those who refuse to be exploited. Rise with the knowledge that you are the makers of history. Rise and claim the future that belongs to you. The power is yours because it always has been. The truth that the oppressed carry within them, often buried beneath years of exploitation and ideological conditioning, is the truth that shakes every ruling class to its core. Society does not stand on the shoulders of the powerful. It stands entirely on the labor, sacrifices, and unrecognized strength of the oppressed. The mighty buildings, the roaring factories, the endless fields, the humming machines, the flowing commodities, all of them, every last one, are the creations of those who are denied both the fruits of their labor and the dignity that their work should command. It is not the wealth of the elite that moves history forward. It is not the authority of rulers, nor the commands of governments, nor the machinery of capital that sustains daily life. It is the working class, the dispossessed, the marginalized, the overlooked, who breathe vitality into society. They generate all material wealth, maintain every vital system, and hold the true potential for transformation. Without their labor, the world stops. Without their participation, the system collapses into dust. And yet, despite this undeniable reality, the oppressed are told that they are powerless. They are conditioned to believe that the ruling class is indispensable, that wealth is a mark of superiority, and that the oppressed are mere background characters in the grand theatre of history. But this illusion is not accidental, it is carefully curated. For only through deception can the ruling class continue to exploit those whose labor actually creates everything. Consider the factory worker who rises before dawn, whose hands guide the machines that produce the goods consumed across the world. Consider the farmer who tills the soil, cultivating the food that fills the tables of every class. Consider the teacher, the builder, the miner, the technician, the caregiver, the countless individuals whose efforts ensure that society functions at every level. These are the individuals whose bodies, minds, and time constitute the very substance of civilization. They are not peripheral, they are the foundation. Yet, what do they receive in return? Wages barely enough to survive, conditions that drain the spirit, alienation from their own work, as though they were mere instruments rather than human beings. Their labor creates wealth for others, and from this wealth arises the illusion that the ruling class is naturally superior. But the truth is simple. The oppressor does not rise because of genius or merit. The oppressor rises because the oppressed are forced to kneel. Strip away the force of habit, the lies of ideology, and the normalization of inequality, and one sees the true structure of society with piercing clarity. The relationship between the oppressed and the ruling class is not a partnership but an extraction. The oppressed provide the energy, skill, and creativity that make everything possible. The ruling class takes this energy and claims it as its own. It is a parasitic relationship disguised as a natural order. But the veneer of inevitability cracks the moment the oppressed recognize their central role. For if the oppressed produce all wealth, then they also possess the power to withdraw it. If they build society, then they also possess the power to reshape it. Their collective strength is not theoretical, it is practical, material, and unstoppable once awakened. 10,000 capitalists cannot stand against 1,000,000 workers who refuse to be exploited. A single factory owner is powerless without the laborers who animate the machines. A government cannot suppress a population that stands united in purpose. The ruling class, despite its arrogance, understands this perfectly. This is why it invests more energy in controlling the consciousness of the oppressed than in producing anything of substance. It must convince the oppressed that they are weak, divided, replaceable. It must sow competition where there should be solidarity. It must turn worker against worker, community against community, to preserve the hierarchy that rests atop their collective labor. But when the oppressed awaken, when they grasp that they are not the margins of society but its very core, everything changes. The chains of exploitation loosen, the myths of inequality dissolve, The fear that once silenced them transforms into resolve, and the power that lay dormant for generations surges to the surface, ready to remake the world. For the oppressed are not merely victims of history, they are the makers of history. Their hands build the world, and with consciousness, unity, and determination, their hands can rebuild it on a foundation of justice, dignity, and true human freedom. The moment the oppressed realize this truth, the foundations of the old world begin to tremble, and from that trembling emerges the first light of the new. There is a comforting fiction that many cling to, a fiction whispered by those who benefit most from inequality, that the suffering of the working class is a tragic side effect, an unfortunate flaw, a mere byproduct of a complex economic order. But this narrative is not only false, it is deliberately crafted to hide the brutal truth. Exploitation is not a flaw of the system, it is the very engine that drives it. The misery of the laborer, the anxiety of the poor, the exhaustion of those who wake before dawn to toil until their bodies give out, none of this is accidental. It does not occur because the system malfunctions, nor because the ruling class fails to notice. It persists because the entire structure of production is built upon the extraction of value from the worker. Without exploitation, the system ceases to function. Without inequality, the powerful lose their dominance. Without the suffering of many, the wealth of the few cannot exist. To understand the modern world, one must begin with a simple observation. Every commodity embodies the unpaid labor of the worker. The value created in factories, fields, workshops, and offices far exceeds the wages given in return. This difference, the gap between what the laborer produces and what they are compensated for, is not a mistake. It is the source of profit itself. The ruling class lives from this difference, amassing wealth through the systematic appropriation of someone else's effort. This is why the worker is paid just enough to survive, but never enough to escape. This is why wages fluctuate with the needs of the market, but profits grow regardless. This is why machinery is introduced to increase productivity, not to reduce toil. Every mechanism of the system is engineered to preserve the flow of surplus from those who produce to those who control. The suffering of the worker is not a deviation, it is an intentional result. Consider the workplace. The endless hours, the surveillance, the hierarchy, the demands for constant productivity. These are not random features, but tools designed to ensure that labor produces maximum value for minimal cost. The worker is treated not as a human being, but as a living instrument of production, whose purpose is to generate wealth for others. If the system sought human flourishing, it would reduce working hours, elevate living standards, and ensure security. But because its purpose is profit, it increases pressure, intensifies extraction, and celebrates competition that pits worker against worker. Even crises, those devastating economic collapses that throw thousands into unemployment, are not accidents. They are woven into the fabric of a system that produces more than it can sell, hires more than it needs, and discards human beings as easily as it discards broken machines. When markets crash, when factories close, when families fall into poverty, the ruling class calls it misfortune. But misfortune for whom? The powerful often emerge from crises richer than before, while the workers bear the cost. This asymmetry is not accidental, it is structural. Ideology serves as the mask that hides the machinery of exploitation. The oppressed are told to work harder, as if their suffering were the result of laziness. They are told to be grateful, as if the crumbs they receive are gifts rather than fragments of their stolen labor. They are told that success is a matter of individual effort, while the reality of systemic domination is buried under illusions of personal failure. Education, media, and culture reinforce these illusions, shaping a worldview in which exploitation appears natural, inevitable, or invisible. The worker blames themselves for their poverty, never the system that keeps them impoverished. They compete with their fellow workers for survival, instead of uniting against the structures that exploit them. These intellectual chains are often stronger than the economic ones. For a person who doubts their own worth rarely challenges their oppressor. But once the veil is lifted, the truth becomes impossible to ignore. The system does not exploit by accident. It exploits by necessity. Profit cannot exist without surplus value, and surplus value cannot exist without the theft of labor. The wealth of the ruling class is nothing but congealed exploitation, accumulated through generations of extraction from those who produce the world but own none of it. The moment the oppressed understand this truth, the foundations of the system begin to crumble. For if exploitation is by design, then liberation cannot come from reforms, charity, or appeals to the conscience of the powerful. It can come only through the organized action of those who refuse to continue suffering for the enrichment of others. The oppressed must therefore reject the lies that justify their misery and recognize the structure that confines them. Only when they see exploitation as deliberate, not accidental, will they begin to reclaim the power that has always belonged to them. The first step toward freedom does not begin with the breaking of chains, nor with the storming of institutions, nor even with the collective uprising of the oppressed. It begins in the mind. It begins the moment the worker looks beyond the surface of society and recognizes the hidden structure that governs their life. This awakening, this profound understanding of one's position within the economic order, is what transforms scattered suffering into collective power. Class consciousness is the beginning of liberation, for without it, the oppressed remain trapped not only by material chains, but by illusions that prevent them from seeing those chains at all. For generations, the oppressed have been taught to accept the world as it is, to believe that inequality is natural, that poverty is accidental, that wealth reflects virtue, and that exploitation is simply the price of progress. These ideas do not arise spontaneously. They are cultivated to ensure that the worker never questions the conditions imposed upon them. A population that does not understand the nature of its oppression cannot resist it. Thus, the ruling class invests heavily in shaping the beliefs, values, and expectations of the oppressed, convincing them that the system that crushes them is the only system possible. Class consciousness is the shattering of this illusion. It is the realization that society is divided not by talent, destiny, or divine decree, but by material interests. On one side stand those who own the means of production: factories, land, machinery, capital. On the other side stand those whose survival depends on selling their labor. The interests of these two groups are not aligned, they are fundamentally opposed. One thrives only by extracting value from the other. One accumulates wealth only through the exploitation of the other's toil. To recognize this antagonism is to understand the true nature of society, a struggle between those who produce wealth and those who appropriate it. This recognition is revolutionary, not because it immediately changes material conditions, but because it transforms consciousness. A worker who believes their suffering is individual will suffer quietly. A worker who understands their suffering is collective begins to seek solidarity. And a class that sees itself as a class united by shared material conditions and shared enemies becomes an unstoppable force. Class consciousness reveals that every injustice faced by the worker is not an isolated incident, but an expression of the underlying system. Unfair wages, long hours, unsafe conditions, job insecurity, these are not separate grievances but symptoms of the same disease. Without this awareness, the oppressed fight their battles alone, mistaking structural oppression for personal misfortune. But with class consciousness, the scattered struggles of individuals converge into a unified movement aimed not at treating symptoms, but at dismantling the economic order that produces them. However, the emergence of class consciousness is not automatic. The ruling class works tirelessly to prevent it, for nothing threatens its power more than an informed and united working class. It promotes the illusion that workers and capitalists share common interests, that loyalty to the nation outweighs loyalty to one's class, that divisions of race, religion, ethnicity, and gender are more important than the fundamental divide between those who labor and those who profit from labor. These tactics are not accidental. They are designed to fracture solidarity and obscure the reality of exploitation. Yet history shows that no amount of ideology can permanently suppress the awakening of the oppressed. Material conditions eventually force workers to question the world around them. When wages stagnate while profits soar, when labor grows more intense while life becomes more precarious, when promises of opportunity collide with the harshness of lived experience, the contradictions of the system become impossible to ignore. In these moments, consciousness begins to pierce through the fog of deception. Class consciousness is not merely intellectual, it is profoundly practical. It allows the oppressed to recognize their collective strength. A single worker cannot challenge the system, but millions who understand their shared struggle can halt production, disrupt power, and reshape society. Awareness becomes organization, organization becomes action, action becomes transformation. The ruling class fears this progression more than any political opposition because it knows that once the workers see themselves as the true creators of society, the legitimacy of the entire system evaporates. To become conscious of one's class is to reclaim the dignity that exploitation attempts to strip away. It is to understand that the worker is not weak but essential, not powerless but foundational. It is to recognize that liberation will never come from the goodwill of the oppressors, but from the unity and determination of the oppressed. Thus, class consciousness is the beginning of liberation because it awakens the workers to their role in history. It opens their eyes to the structural nature of their suffering. It unites them under a shared purpose. It transforms despair into defiance and defiance into action. With consciousness comes power. With power comes transformation, and with transformation comes the birth of a new world. If there is one force in society capable of shaking empires, dismantling hierarchies, and overturning centuries of oppression, it is not the wealth of the elite, nor the strength of their armies, nor the influence of their institutions. It is the unity of the workers. Nothing terrifies the ruling class more than the moment the oppressed recognize their shared condition, their collective strength, and their historic role as the true makers of society. Unity is the catalyst that transforms scattered suffering into organized resistance, isolated frustration into coordinated struggle, and passive endurance into active rebellion. The ruling class, for all its displays of power, is fundamentally fragile. Its wealth is not created by its own labor, but extracted from those who work. Its authority is not rooted in moral legitimacy, but imposed through control over institutions and ideology. Its survival depends entirely on the continued fragmentation of the oppressed, for if the workers unite across factories, fields, offices and borders, the system that exploits them crumbles under its own contradictions. This is why the ruling class fears unity more than any weapon. A united working class can halt production, disrupt capital, and reclaim the wealth it creates. A divided working class, however, remains manageable, isolated, competitive, and unaware of its collective power. The elite understand this truth with absolute clarity, even when the workers themselves have yet to awaken to it. Thus, the ruling class invests more effort in dividing the oppressed than in producing anything of substance. They manufacture divisions where none exist naturally. They cultivate identities that pit one worker against another. They elevate superficial differences, nationality, religion, race, language, gender, so that workers see each other as rivals rather than allies. They encourage competition for scarce wages, scarce jobs, scarce opportunities, so that the battle is no longer between the worker and the oppressor, but between worker and worker. This is the most insidious form of domination, the turning of the oppressed against themselves. For as long as the workers are divided, they will never challenge the conditions that exploit them. As long as they see each other as enemies, they will never recognize their shared struggle. And as long as they believe that the ruling class is their protector rather than their oppressor, they will remain trapped in a cycle of subordination. But unity exposes these illusions. When workers stand together, they realize that their enemy has never been the worker beside them, but the systems above them. They recognize that exploitation is not the product of cultural, religious, or ethnic differences, but of a material relationship in which one class profits from the labor of another. Unity reveals that workers across the world share more in common with each other than with the elite of their own nations. It reveals that the working class is global, while the ruling class uses artificial boundaries to maintain its control. The history of struggle shows that every meaningful transformation, every revolution, every step toward justice emerged when workers recognized their shared interests. The ruling class has never voluntarily surrendered its privileges. It has been forced to concede only when the workers organized, mobilized, and confronted the structures that oppressed them. Unity is the weapon that has repeatedly shifted the course of history, not the charity of the powerful, but the solidarity of the oppressed. And unity is more than a tactic, it is a consciousness. It is the recognition that the liberation of one worker is bound to the liberation of all. It is the understanding that no individual can escape systemic exploitation while others remain in chains. It is the awareness that collective struggle is not merely an option but a necessity. For the individual worker, isolated and alone, is vulnerable. But millions united under a common cause possess power that no ruling class can suppress. When workers unite, the fear that grips the ruling class is not imaginary, it is grounded in material reality. A united working class can shut down factories, halt transportation, disrupt supply chains, and bring the machinery of capital to a standstill. Their unity strikes at the heart of the system, revealing how dependent the powerful are on those they claim to dominate. The ruling class knows that once workers recognize this dependency, the balance of power shifts irreversibly. The greatest fear of the elite is not protest, nor dissent, nor even revolution in the abstract. Their greatest fear is that workers will see the truth, that they are the majority, the producers of wealth, and the rightful stewards of society. Their greatest fear is that workers will refuse to be divided, refuse to fight each other for survival, while the few grow rich from their labor. Their greatest fear is that workers will unite not only in struggle but in vision, in purpose, and in the belief that a new society is possible. Unity is the force that transforms the oppressed from victims of history into authors of history. It is the dawn that signals the end of exploitation's long night. When workers finally unite across all divisions, the power of the ruling class dissolves like mist before the rising sun. Social transformation has never emerged from the goodwill of the powerful, nor from isolated heroic acts, nor from the quiet suffering of individuals hoping that circumstances might one day improve. Meaningful change, structural, lasting, revolutionary, has only ever arisen when the oppressed unite as a collective force. The history of human society is not a tale of lone figures reshaping the world, but of masses who, awakened to their shared condition, refuse to remain passive instruments of exploitation. Collective action is not merely a strategy, it is the material foundation of all social transformation. In every epoch, the ruling class has relied on the fragmentation of the oppressed. So long as workers remain isolated, each concerned with their own survival, their own wages, their own struggles, the system remains stable. The powerful thrive on this division, for a divided class cannot recognize its shared interests or challenge the structures that keep it subjugated. When individuals confront oppression alone, their resistance becomes a whisper drowned out by the machinery of capital. But when they unite, that whisper becomes a roar that reverberates through the entire social order. The nature of oppression itself reveals why collective action is indispensable. The exploitation faced by the worker is not an individual problem, it is systemic. It is not the result of a single exploitative employer, an unfair supervisor, or a cruel policy. These are merely expressions of a deeper structure in which one class extracts value from another. Thus, the suffering of the worker in one factory mirrors the suffering of the worker in another, whether in a distant city or across a national border. Their experiences, though separated by geography or circumstance, are rooted in the same material conditions. This commonality forms the basis of their unity. In understanding this shared struggle, the workers begin to recognize that their liberation cannot be achieved by isolated acts of defiance. A single refusal, a solitary protest, a lone disruption, these actions may inspire but cannot transform society. The system can crush individuals with ease, but a class conscious of its collective power becomes ungovernable. When millions move together, synchronized by purpose and driven by the understanding of their historical role, they wield a force capable of breaking the backbone of exploitation. Collective action derives its power from its ability to confront the system where it is most vulnerable, the production and reproduction of social life. Every institution that the ruling class depends upon, factories, supply chains, transportation networks, communication infrastructures, relies on the labor of the oppressed. The moment workers withdraw this labor, the machinery of profit grinds to a halt. A strike is not merely a refusal to work, it is a demonstration of the worker's central role in sustaining society. And when strikes expand into mass movements, when fields, factories, and offices unite, the system begins to tremble. But collective action is not limited to the economic sphere, it also reshapes consciousness. When the oppressed come together, they begin to see themselves not as isolated individuals but as members of a unified class with shared interests. They break free from the ideological chains that portray exploitation as natural or unavoidable. Their gatherings become spaces of education, solidarity, and awakening. In these moments, a new kind of human being emerges, one who understands that their struggle is not for individual survival but for collective liberation. This is why the ruling class fears collective action more than anything else. It can tolerate criticism, absorb reforms, and manipulate elections. But it cannot withstand a united working class that refuses to participate in its own exploitation. Thus, the powerful deploy countless tools to suppress collective action: legal barriers, propaganda, surveillance, manufactured divisions, and ideological illusions. They encourage competition instead of cooperation, isolation instead of solidarity, despair instead of hope. Yet, despite these obstacles, collective action continues to rise wherever material conditions sharpen the contradictions of society. When inequality becomes intolerable, when exploitation intensifies, when promises of opportunity collapse under the reality of economic domination, the workers are pushed toward unity. Their shared suffering becomes the spark of shared resistance. Social transformation depends on collective action, not merely because unity empowers the oppressed, but because the act of uniting itself begins to create the new world. In the assemblies, in the strikes, in the marches, in the shared struggle, the workers begin to dismantle hierarchy and build equality. They challenge the old order while prefiguring the new. A society rooted in cooperation, not competition, in justice, not exploitation, in collective well-being, not private profit. Thus, liberation is not a gift. It is not the result of negotiations with the oppressor or the benevolence of the elite. Liberation is the outcome of the oppressed discovering their collective strength and acting upon it. Only through their united power can they break the structures that bind them and construct a society worthy of human dignity. Collective action is not merely the path to social transformation, it is the force that makes transformation inevitable. The journey through these ideas leads us to a simple but undeniable truth. A society built on inequality cannot sustain itself without obscuring the very forces that keep it intact. The daily struggles of working people, exhaustion, insecurity, and the quiet erosion of dignity are not personal failures but structural necessities for a system that relies on division, hierarchy, and the concentration of power. Yet within this harsh reality lies the seed of transformation. For the same conditions that exploit the many ultimately reveal the common thread binding them together. When workers recognize that their frustrations are shared, that their hardships are not isolated events but expressions of a larger design, a profound awakening begins. This awakening is not merely intellectual, it is the stirring of a collective force far greater than any individual effort. It is the realization that unity is not just desirable, it is essential. Because every barrier that isolates one worker from another, whether crafted through competition, fear, propaganda, or manufactured distrust, serves only to protect those who benefit from the status quo. The ruling strata fear nothing more than cooperation among those who labor, because cooperation exposes their power as fragile and dependent. It reveals that the entire structure rests not on superior intellect, birthright, or divine sanction, but on the continued acceptance of an arrangement that serves the few at the cost of the many. Once this illusion crumbles, the balance shifts. People begin to understand that collective action is not an act of rebellion, it is an act of reclaiming what has always belonged to them, their dignity, their agency, their future. And yet transformation is never spontaneous. It demands organization, clarity of purpose, and a willingness to confront not only external restraints, but the internalized beliefs that keep individuals compliant. Systems endure because they shape consciousness. Liberation requires reshaping that consciousness through education, solidarity, and shared struggle. True change arises when individuals stop viewing themselves as isolated laborers and start recognizing themselves as part of a vast, interdependent force capable of reshaping society. The path toward a more just and humane world will not be paved by passive hope or by waiting for those in power to develop a conscience. It emerges through deliberate, coordinated efforts, through communities coming together, through workers supporting one another, through voices refusing to be silenced or divided. When the many act as one, the myth of inevitability dissolves, exposing the possibility of a new social order grounded in cooperation rather than exploitation. Thus, the conclusion is clear. The future is not predetermined. It is shaped by the will of ordinary people who decide they will no longer be tools in the hands of the powerful. It is shaped by solidarity strong enough to counter fear, unity resilient enough to withstand manipulation, and collective action determined enough to build a world where the wealth created by the many serves the many. In that future, individuals are not mere cogs but creators, not subjects of a system but architects of a society rooted in fairness, shared prosperity, and human dignity. The transformation begins the moment people understand their true strength and choose to use it together.